My roommate made her family stay just a week, but stayed 3 months and took over my apartment. So I invited my own loud, messy family to deal with them. My roommate Iris invited her entire family to stay in our 2-bedroom apartment for just a week in January, but it's been 3 months and they're still here. She told me her parents and 2 brothers needed a place to crash while their house was being fumigated, and it would be 7 days maximum. I said fine because I understood emergencies happened and wanted to be a good roommate. Her parents took over the living room, her brothers slept in her room with her, and suddenly our apartment meant for 2 people had 6 people living in it. After the first week passed, I asked Iris when they were leaving, and she said the fumigation revealed additional problems, so they needed a few more days. I was annoyed but tried to be understanding. 2 weeks became 3 and then 4 with new excuses each time, like waiting for repairs, insurance issues, and contractor delays. By February, her family had completely taken over the apartment and acted like they owned it. Her mother rearranged my kitchen and threw out my spices because she said they were expired even though they weren't. Her father sat in his underwear on our couch all day watching television at full volume while working from home. Her brothers ate all my food from the fridge and used my bathroom products without asking. When I confronted Iris, she said I was being unwelcoming and they were going through a hard time. She said I had no idea what it was like to have family in need and I should be more compassionate. I reminded her that we split rent 50-50 for a 2-bedroom apartment, not a homeless shelter for her relatives. She said it was temporary and I needed to stop being selfish about space I wasn't even using during the day while at work. Her family started treating me like I was the intruder in my own home. Her mother would tell me I was cooking wrong in my own kitchen and take over making dinner without asking. Her father would change the channel when I was watching something because he said renters didn't get priority over guests. Her brothers would bring friends over without asking and party in the living room until 3 in the morning on weeknights. When I complained to Iris, she said her family was just trying to feel comfortable during a stressful time, and I was making it worse. By March, I discovered the truth when her brother let slip that their house had been foreclosed on months ago, and they had nowhere else to go. There was never any fumigation or repairs, just a family that lost their home and decided mine would do. Iris admitted she'd lied but said I wouldn't have let them stay if I'd known the truth. She said they were looking for a new place but needed more time and I couldn't possibly kick out a homeless family. I gave them 2 weeks to leave or I'd involve the landlord. Iris laughed and said they were tenants now after living here for 2 months, so I'd need to formally evict them, which would take months. She said she'd looked up the law and I couldn't just throw them out anymore. Her family got bolder after that, knowing I couldn't easily remove them. Her mother started redecorating with her own furniture she'd put in storage. Her father set up a whole office in the corner of the living room. Her brothers moved their gaming systems in and took over the television completely. They stopped pretending it was temporary and started receiving mail at our address. That's when I decided to make their stay so miserable they'd leave voluntarily. I started by cutting off the wireless internet since it was in my name and I paid for it. When they complained, I said internet wasn't included in their non-existent rental agreement. Her father couldn't work from home anymore and had to go to coffee shops. Her brothers couldn't game online and threw tantrums about it. Iris begged me to turn it back on, but I said guests didn't get internet privileges after overstaying their welcome. Next, I removed everything I owned from common areas, including my television, my streaming device, my gaming console, my kitchen appliances, my pots and pans, my dishes, my furniture, everything. I then started playing music in my room at all hours, since apparently noise wasn't an issue in our apartment anymore. Death metal at 6 a.m., techno at midnight, country music on repeat while I was at work. When they complained, I reminded them about all their late-night parties and said I was just trying to feel comfortable in my stressful living situation. I also started charging them for utilities, presenting Iris with a bill for 5 people's worth of electricity, water, and gas for 3 months. When she refused to pay, I had the utilities transferred to her name since she claimed they were tenants. Suddenly, she was responsible for hundreds in deposits and past due amounts. The turning point came when I invited my own family to visit for a week. My parents, my sister, her husband, and their 3 kids all showed up to stay. I told Iris my family needed the living room so hers would have to share her bedroom. When she said that was impossible, I said she'd made it work before, and they could do it again. My family was loud, messy, and constantly in the way just like hers had been. My parents walked in first carrying their suitcases and sleeping bags, and my mom headed straight for the kitchen where Grace was standing. Grace's eyes went wide as my mom started opening cabinets and moving things around without asking, pulling out Grace's carefully organized spice rack and setting it on the counter. My dad dropped his bag on the couch right in Melvin's usual spot and sat down in his underwear spot like he owned it. Melvin was sitting there in actual pants for once and had to scoot over to make room, looking uncomfortable and confused. Ellen came in next with her husband and their 3 kids, and Kira and Sydney immediately started pulling out toys and spreading them across the living room floor. Grace and Melvin watched from their corner with horror on their faces as more and more people filled the small space. My mom found Grace's spice collection and started picking through it, holding up bottles to the light. Sebastian and Bruno emerged from Iris's bedroom to see what the noise was about, and stopped dead when they saw my entire family taking over their space. My dad turned on the television and cranked up the volume to watch sports, and Melvin flinched at the sudden noise. Ellen's kids were running around screaming and playing, and their toys were everywhere within minutes. Iris grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway outside the apartment, her face red and her voice shaking with anger. She said this was completely unacceptable and I couldn't just invite people to live here without asking her first. I smiled sweetly and reminded her that she did exactly that 3 months ago when she brought her entire family to stay. She said that was different because it was an emergency, and I said my family needed a place to stay for a week just like hers did. Iris said there wasn't room for all these people and someone was going to get hurt with kids running around everywhere. I told her she made it work with 6 people before, so we could make it work with 11 people now. She said I was being petty and childish, and I said I was being a good family member just like she was. Iris said her family had nowhere else to go and mine probably had perfectly good homes to stay in. I reminded her that she lied about that, and her family never had an emergency in the first place. She looked like she wanted to argue more but didn't have a good response, so she just stormed back inside. The first night was complete chaos with 11 people trying to exist in a space meant for 2. Everyone needed to use the bathroom at different times, and there was always someone waiting outside the door. Kira started crying around 8 because she was tired and uncomfortable sleeping on the floor. Sydney joined in crying a few minutes later because her sister was upset. Sebastian and Bruno couldn't get to their gaming systems because my family's stuff was piled in front of them. Ellen's husband tried to set up a sleeping area for his family but kept bumping into Grace and Melvin's stuff. My dad was snoring loudly on the couch by 9 and the sound echoed through the whole apartment. Iris's brothers looked miserable trying to navigate around all the new people to get to the bedroom. Grace kept trying to organize her corner, but my mom's bags were in her way. Nobody could watch television because my dad had claimed it and fallen asleep with it on full volume. Ellen was trying to calm down her crying daughters while her husband unpacked their things. Melvin retreated to Iris's bedroom early to escape the noise. Sebastian and Bruno followed him shortly after, and I could hear them complaining through the door about the invasion. Grace came out of Iris's bedroom the next morning to make breakfast and found my mom already in the kitchen. My mom had pulled everything out of the cabinets and was reorganizing them her way, moving Grace's pots to different shelves and rearranging the spices. Grace asked what she was doing, and my mom said she was just making herself comfortable while she stayed here. My mom picked up Grace's cumin and said it looked expired even though the date on the bottle showed it was fine. Grace's face turned red and she said those spices were perfectly good and she'd just bought most of them recently. My mom tossed the cumin in the trash anyway and said better safe than sorry when it came to food safety. I watched from the doorway as Grace experienced the exact same frustration I'd felt months ago when she did this to my kitchen. My mom found Grace's paprika next and held it up to examine it. Grace tried to take it from her, but my mom moved it out of reach. My mom said she'd cook breakfast for everyone since she was already in the kitchen anyway. Grace said this was her kitchen, and she'd been planning to make food for her family. My mom said there were too many people now for Grace to cook for everyone, so she'd handle it. Grace looked at me like she wanted me to intervene, but I just shrugged and went to get coffee. Melvin set up his laptop at the small dining table to work from home like he did every day. My dad and Ellen's husband sat down right next to him and started talking loudly about last night's game. Melvin tried to ignore them and focus on his screen, but they kept getting louder. Ellen's husband asked my dad if he saw that play in the fourth quarter, and my dad launched into a detailed analysis. Melvin put in headphones, but the conversation was so loud he could still hear it through the music. He finally asked them politely if they could keep it down because he was trying to work. My dad looked at him and said, "Guests didn't get to dictate noise levels in someone else's home." Melvin said he wasn't a guest. He'd been living here for months, and my dad said that didn't give him any special rights. Ellen's husband asked Melvin if he wanted to join their conversation instead of working, and Melvin said no through gritted teeth. My dad and Ellen's husband went right back to their loud discussion about sports. Melvin tried to work for another 10 minutes before giving up and packing his laptop to leave. He muttered something about going to a coffee shop where he could actually concentrate. Grace watched him go with a worried expression. The second day was somehow worse than the first because everyone was tired and cranky from the bad night's sleep. Iris's family kept trying to escape to other rooms, but my family had spread out everywhere. Sebastian went to the living room and found Ellen's kids playing with toys all over the floor where his gaming setup was. Bruno tried to watch television, but my dad was already there watching his shows. Grace attempted to cook lunch, but my mom was still occupying the kitchen from breakfast. Melvin came back from the coffee shop looking exhausted and found my dad in his spot on the couch again. Sebastian and Bruno both looked terrible with dark circles under their eyes from sleeping on Iris's bedroom floor with 4 people crammed in there. Iris herself looked like she hadn't slept at all. Ellen's kids were running around with endless energy despite the crowded conditions. My parents seemed perfectly comfortable and settled in like they planned to stay forever. Grace kept shooting angry looks at my mom whenever she walked through the kitchen. The apartment smelled like too many people living in too small a space. Everyone was getting on everyone else's nerves, and it was only day 2. I found my mom in the hallway and pulled her aside to thank her for helping me with this situation. I explained that this exact chaos had been my life for the past 3 months with Iris's family taking over. My mom hugged me tight and said no daughter of hers was going to be pushed around in her own home. She said they'd stay as long as I needed them to stay to make my point. I felt grateful to have family who understood what I was going through and was willing to help, even though it was uncomfortable for them too. My mom said Iris's family had taken advantage of my kindness, and it was time they learned some boundaries. She asked if I was doing okay emotionally with all this stress. I admitted it had been really hard, but seeing Iris's family experience what they put me through made me feel a little better. My mom said sometimes you had to fight fire with fire to get people to understand. She squeezed my hand and told me to let her know if I needed anything else. I thanked her again and felt less alone than I had in months. Iris cornered me in my bedroom later that afternoon with a desperate look on her face. She said her family would start paying for utilities and buying their own food if I made my family leave. I told her we were way past the point of negotiations about utilities and groceries. She said she was trying to compromise and find a solution we could both live with. I asked her when her family was planning to move out permanently like they should have done months ago. Iris said they were still looking for a place, but it took time to find something affordable. I said 3 months was plenty of time, and they clearly weren't trying hard enough. She said the housing market was tough, and they couldn't just snap their fingers and find an apartment. I reminded her that wasn't my problem since she lied about why they needed to stay in the first place. Iris started crying and said I was being cruel to people who were already struggling. I said she was being manipulative by using her family's situation to guilt me after months of taking advantage. She asked what it would take for me to make my family leave. I said nothing short of her entire family moving out immediately would make me send mine home. My phone rang while I was making dinner and I saw it was the landlord calling. I answered, and he asked if I knew anything about noise complaints and too many people coming and going from the apartment. I took a deep breath and decided to tell him everything honestly. I explained that Iris had invited her family to stay for a week 3 months ago, and they never left. He asked how many people were living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and I said 6 until recently when I was invited my own family to stay. He was quiet for a moment and then said that was way over the occupancy limits in the lease agreement. I said I knew, and I'd been trying to get Iris's family to leave for months. He asked why I didn't tell him sooner, and I said I was trying to handle it myself first. He said he appreciated me being honest now, but this was a serious violation that could get us both evicted. I explained that Iris lied about it being temporary, and her family actually lost their house to foreclosure. The landlord said that didn't matter because the lease clearly stated maximum occupancy, and Iris had been breaking it for months. He asked if Iris's family was still there, and I said yes. No. He said he'd be sending a formal notice and we'd need to fix this immediately. The next day, a notice showed up taped to our apartment door. Iris ripped it down and read it with shaking hands, her face going pale. The notice said she was in violation of the lease agreement by having unauthorized long-term guests, and her family had to leave within 7 days or face eviction proceedings. Iris ran to find me and shoved the paper in my face, asking if I told the landlord about her family. I said yes because he asked me directly, and I wasn't going to lie for her. She said I just ruined everything, and now her family would be homeless on the street. I said her family was never supposed to be here in the first place, and she created this mess herself. Iris begged me to call the landlord and tell him it was a misunderstanding. I said absolutely not because it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. She started crying harder and said 7 days wasn't enough time to find a place. I reminded her that she'd had 3 months to find a place and chose to stay here instead. Iris said I was heartless and didn't care that her family had nowhere to go. I said I cared about my own home and my own peace more than I cared about people who took advantage of me. I said her family made my life hell, and now they could deal with mine making theirs just as bad. Iris stormed off to her room where her entire family was crammed together like sardines in a can. That night was pure chaos with 11 people fighting over the single bathroom and trying to find sleeping space in an apartment meant for 2. My nieces cried because the floor was hard and uncomfortable, which made me feel bad until I remembered how her brothers had partied until 3 in the morning for weeks. The next morning started with Grace and my mom both heading into the kitchen at the same time to make breakfast. My mom got there first and started pulling out ingredients while Grace stood there with her arms crossed looking annoyed. Grace moved my mom's eggs to the side and put her own pan on the stove, and my mom moved it right back. They kept shifting each other's stuff around without saying a word, just giving each other cold stares that could freeze water. My mom ended up making a huge spread of pancakes, bacon, eggs, and hash browns that filled the entire kitchen with amazing smells. My family descended on the food like locusts and ate every single bite while Iris's family sat in the corner of the living room watching with hungry eyes. Grace had only managed to make toast before my mom took over completely, and now there was nothing left for her family to eat. I felt a tiny bit guilty watching them sit there with empty stomachs, but then I remembered all the times they'd eaten my groceries without asking, and the guilt disappeared. Later that morning, my dad made some pointed comments about how inappropriate it was to walk around in underwear when there were children present. Melvin finally put on actual pants for the first time since I could remember, and the small victory felt amazing after months of being uncomfortable in my own living room. Sebastian and Bruno tried to make friends with my brother-in-law by talking about sports and video games, clearly hoping to create some kind of male alliance against the women. My brother-in-law just gave them short answers and kept walking away to help my sister with the kids. Every attempt they made to bond got shut down fast because he was loyal to me and knew what they'd put me through. The apartment had become 2 hostile camps sharing impossible quarters, with my family on one side and Iris's family on the other. My nieces ran around playing tag and screaming at the top of their lungs, making it impossible for anyone to relax or think. They knocked over a cup of water, stepped on someone's phone charger, and kept asking loud questions about everything they saw. Sebastian sat on the floor looking ready to lose his mind after being unable to game in peace for days. I watched him getting more and more frustrated, and felt zero sympathy remembering all his late-night parties that kept me awake on work nights. On day 3 of this madness, Iris came to my room with tears streaming down her face and mascara running everywhere. She admitted her family had nowhere to go and no money saved for deposits on a new place because they'd been spending everything just trying to survive. She begged for mercy and asked what she could do to fix this horrible situation we were all trapped in. I told her the only acceptable solution was her family leaving permanently, and I'd give them 2 weeks to find somewhere if they started apartment hunting immediately, and followed strict rules until then. She agreed desperately while crying even harder, knowing the landlord's 7-day deadline was even worse than my 2-week offer. My family packed up their stuff after their planned week was done, loading suitcases and sleeping bags into cars while Iris's family watched from the windows. My mom pulled me aside before leaving and asked if I was really okay dealing with this mess for 2 more weeks. I assured her I could handle it now that there was an actual end date and real consequences in place if Iris's family didn't follow through. With my family gone, the apartment felt slightly less insane, but still way too crowded with 6 people living in 2 bedrooms. I laid out strict rules for Iris's family, including quiet hours from 10 at night to 7 in the morning, staying completely out of my bedroom. And my stuff, replacing any food they ate and showing me proof they were actually apartment hunting every single day. Grace came to me later that afternoon and apologized stiffly for rearranging my kitchen months ago, clearly only doing it because she'd just experienced the same violation from my mom. I accepted her apology but didn't pretend we were suddenly friends, or that everything was fine, keeping my tone coldly polite and distant. Melvin started spending entire days at coffee shops and the library to work and escape the awful tension in the apartment. Iris's brothers were gone most of the time too, crashing with friends whenever possible and only coming back to sleep, which made the apartment way more bearable than it had been in months. The next day, Iris knocked on my bedroom door holding her laptop with apartment listings pulled up on the screen. She sat on the edge of my bed and turned the computer toward me, scrolling through pages of rental ads she'd already contacted. Most places wanted first month, last month, and security deposit up front, which would be over $4,000 her family didn't have. Other listings said no pets, no kids, no more than 2 occupants when her family was 4 people. Some landlords had already responded, saying they wouldn't rent to people without recent rental history or good credit scores. I watched Iris's face get tighter as she clicked through each rejection email, each impossible requirement, each place that cost way more than her parents could afford on their combined income. A studio apartment an hour outside the city wanted $1,800 a month plus utilities. A basement room with no windows required 3 months rent up front. A house share situation said adults only, no exceptions. The reality of how hard it was to find housing when you were desperate started sinking in for all of us. Iris closed the laptop and admitted her parents had applied to 20 places in the past week, and heard back from exactly 2, both rejections. I felt a weird mix of satisfaction that my plan was working, and uncomfortable awareness that I was watching people struggle with actual homelessness. Grace had been calling numbers all morning from the living room, her voice getting more strained with each conversation as landlords turned her down or quoted prices she couldn't pay. Melvin had started looking at rooms for rent in people's houses, the kind of situation where you share a bathroom with strangers and can't have guests, but even those wanted deposits they didn't have saved up. 3 days later, I met my friend who works as a lawyer at a coffee shop downtown to ask about the legal situation. She ordered a latte and pulled out a notebook, asking me specific questions about when Iris's family arrived, what the lease said about guests, whether they'd received mail at the address, if they'd paid any rent or utilities. I explained the whole timeline from January through now, how the landlord had already sent an eviction notice, how Iris claimed they had tenant rights after 3 months. My friend nodded and said the law was complicated, but basically Iris was partly right that you can't just throw people out after they've lived somewhere that long. However, the landlord's eviction notice gave me serious leverage because it proved the lease was violated, and Iris had brought them in without permission. She said I could potentially sue Iris in small claims court for my portion of the increased utility bills over 3 months, plus compensation for the lease violation and stress of having my housing situation disrupted. The lawsuit probably wouldn't get me much money, but it would create legal pressure that might motivate Iris's family to leave faster. She warned me that actually going through with eviction proceedings could take 2 or 3 months minimum and cost money for court fees. The fastest solution was still convincing them to leave voluntarily, which my tactics seemed to be accomplishing already. I thanked her and paid for both our drinks, feeling more confident that I had legal options if Iris's family tried to dig in and refused to go. That evening, I found Iris in the kitchen making dinner, and casually mentioned I'd talked to a lawyer about possibly suing her for the utility costs and lease violation. She dropped the wooden spoon she was holding and it clattered into the sink, sauce splattering everywhere. Her face went completely white, and she grabbed the counter like she needed it to stay standing. I kept my voice calm and explained that my lawyer friend said I had a good case for at least $800 in damages, maybe more if I could prove emotional distress from months of having my home invaded. Iris started crying right there in the kitchen, tears running down her face and her whole body shaking. She admitted she knew what she did was wrong, that she'd lied and manipulated me and violated our lease agreement. She said she felt trapped when her parents lost their house because they had nowhere else to go, and she panicked. The words came out between sobs about how she didn't know what else to do, how her family would have been literally homeless on the street, how she thought if she just bought them time, they'd figure something out. I felt a flicker of sympathy watching her break down completely, but I reminded myself she chose to lie from the very start instead of being honest and asking properly. She could have told me the truth about the foreclosure, and we could have made a real plan together. Instead, she trapped me with deception and let her family take over my home for months. I told her the lawsuit was still on the table depending on how cooperative everyone was about leaving, then walked away while she cried into her hands. 2 days later, the landlord showed up unannounced for a surprise inspection. He knocked on the door at 10 in the morning and I let him in, watching his face change as he walked through the apartment. He pulled out his phone and started taking photos of the crowded living room with sleeping bags and suitcases everywhere, the kitchen packed with too many people's food, the bathroom cluttered with 6 people's toiletries and products. Grace and Melvin stood awkwardly in the corner while he documented everything, making notes on a clipboard about occupancy violations and lease breaches. He counted the people present, asked who was actually on the lease, took more photos of Melvin's makeshift office setup in the living room. When he finished his inspection, he pulled me aside privately in the hallway outside the apartment. He told me he definitely wasn't renewing Iris's lease when it expired in 3 months, and asked if I wanted to stay with a different roommate he could help me find. I said I was seriously considering it, relieved to know I had options that didn't involve moving out myself. He said he'd start the formal eviction process if Iris's family wasn't gone within the deadline he'd already given them, and he'd be checking in regularly now to make sure they actually left. The inspection felt like validation that I wasn't crazy for being upset about this situation, that what Iris did was actually wrong and violated real rules. The very next evening, Grace and Melvin called everyone into the living room for an announcement. They'd found a room to rent in someone's house about an hour away in a cheaper area outside the city. It wasn't ideal because it was just 1 bedroom for both of them with a shared bathroom and kitchen, but it was something they could afford immediately with the money they had saved. The landlord only wanted first month's rent and a small deposit, and he was willing to accept their situation without perfect credit or rental history. Relief washed over everyone's faces when they said they'd be moving out in 3 days. Iris looked like she might cry from sheer gratitude that her parents had somewhere to go. Sebastian and Bruno actually smiled for the first time in weeks. Even I felt the tension in my shoulders release slightly, knowing this nightmare had an actual end date now. Grace started making lists of what they needed to pack and what could stay in storage. Melvin called the landlord back to confirm they'd take the room and arrange the move-in date. The apartment felt different that night. Like everyone could finally breathe knowing the impossible situation was actually resolving. Over the next 3 days, Grace packed up all the storage furniture and decorations she'd moved into our apartment. I watched her wrap dishes in newspaper and load boxes, noticing how worn and tired she looked. Her hands shook slightly as she folded clothes and her face had deep lines I hadn't noticed before. Despite everything that happened, I recognized they were a family struggling with real hardship, even if they'd handled it terribly. Losing your home and scrambling to find housing while trying to maintain jobs and dignity would break anyone down. Grace caught me watching and gave me a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she was sorry for how things went and she understood why I was angry. I nodded but didn't say much back, still too hurt by the months of boundary violations to offer real forgiveness. The furniture she'd brought looked shabby and old as it got loaded into a rental truck, the kind of worn possessions people accumulate when money is always tight. Her decorations were mostly dollar store items and faded photos in cheap frames. I realized this family didn't take over my apartment because they were entitled or cruel, but because they were desperate and scared and didn't have better options. On moving day, Melvin came to find me before they loaded the last boxes. He stuck out his hand and I shook it, confused about what was happening. He apologized for making me uncomfortable in my own home, for sitting around in his underwear and taking over my living room and not respecting my space. It was the first direct acknowledgement from anyone in Iris's family that they'd crossed serious boundaries and violated my right to feel safe in my own apartment. His voice was quiet, and he looked genuinely ashamed, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He said they'd been so focused on their own crisis they hadn't thought about what they were doing to me, and that wasn't fair or right. I accepted his apology and told him I hoped their new place worked out, meaning it more than I expected to. He nodded and went back to help Grace load the truck. Within 2 hours, they were gone. The living room suddenly empty and quiet in a way that felt almost strange after months of constant occupation. With Grace and Melvin gone, Sebastian and Bruno moved back to sleeping in the living room temporarily, while they kept searching for their own places. The apartment felt almost normal again with just 4 people instead of 6. We could use the bathroom without waiting in line. The kitchen wasn't constantly crowded. The television was available for everyone. But tension still hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable, everyone moving carefully around each other like we were all made of glass. Sebastian spent most of his time on his laptop looking at roommate wanted ads and texting friends about housing leads. Bruno was gone during the day working and apartment hunting, only coming back late at night to sleep. Iris barely spoke to anyone. keeping to her room when she was home. I started cooking my own meals again and watching shows in the living room, reclaiming small pieces of my normal life. The apartment felt bigger without Grace and Melvin's presence, but also sadder somehow, like we were all living in the ruins of something that got destroyed. A week after her parents left, Iris asked if we could talk, and I agreed. We sat in the living room after her brothers went to bed and had the longest, most difficult conversation we'd ever had. She admitted she should have been honest from the very start when her parents lost their house, that she should have asked me properly instead of lying about fumigation and trapping me with deception. She said she panicked and made terrible choices because she couldn't stand the thought of her family being homeless, but she knew that didn't excuse what she did to me. I told her the betrayal of trust was what hurt most, even more than the inconvenience and stress of having 6 people in our apartment. We'd been decent roommates before this happened, and she threw that away by lying to my face for months. She could have come to me honestly, and we could have figured out a real solution together, maybe helped her family find resources, or given them a few weeks with clear boundaries. Instead, she manipulated me and let her family treat me like garbage in my own home. Iris cried and said she understood if I never forgave her, that she'd ruined our friendship and our living situation permanently. I said I didn't know about forgiveness yet, but I appreciated her finally being honest. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a while before both going to our rooms, the conversation feeling incomplete but necessary. A week later, Sebastian came home excited and announced he'd found a friend who needed roommates in an apartment across town. The place had 3 bedrooms, and 2 of the guys living there were people he'd known from college, so he'd be moving out within a week. He started packing up his gaming setup immediately, carefully wrapping controllers and organizing cables. The living room got dismantled piece by piece as he loaded equipment into boxes. Iris helped him carry stuff to his car on moving day, both of them looking relieved that he had somewhere stable to go. With Sebastian gone, we finally got the living room back completely, the television available again, and the space feeling open and breathable. 2 days later, Bruno announced he was moving in with his girlfriend's family temporarily, just until he saved enough for his own place. He packed his stuff quickly and left with barely a goodbye, clearly uncomfortable about the whole situation. The apartment was suddenly just Iris and me again, like it had been back in January before any of this started, but everything felt different and broken now. We passed each other in the hallway like polite strangers sharing an elevator, not 2 people who'd lived together for over a year before everything fell apart. Iris kept her eyes down when she walked from her bedroom to the bathroom, and I did the same when I headed to the kitchen. The apartment felt bigger somehow now that it was just us 2 again, but also emptier in a way that made my chest feel tight. We'd managed to coexist before her family arrived, splitting chores and occasionally watching shows together on weekends, but that version of our roommate relationship was gone forever. The trust we'd built over months of living together had shattered into pieces too small to put back together. I sat at the kitchen table one evening with my laptop open and started going through bank statements and utility bills from the past 3 months. Every time I saw a charge that was higher than normal, I added it to my spreadsheet with the date and amount. The electric bill had nearly doubled in February when 6 people were running space heaters and leaving lights on all day. Water costs jumped 40% with everyone taking long showers and doing constant loads of laundry. My grocery receipts showed I'd spent an extra $200 replacing food that disappeared from the fridge. The internet bill stayed the same, but I calculated what 3 months of service cost since I'd paid for it while they used it without permission. When I added everything up, the total came to $830 of extra costs I'd covered while her family freeloaded. I printed out the spreadsheet with every charge highlighted and walked to Iris's bedroom door. She opened it after I knocked, and her face went pale when she saw the papers in my hand. I handed her the itemized bill without saying anything at first, letting her read through each line. She didn't argue or make excuses, just nodded slowly, and asked if I'd accept payments over time since she couldn't afford to pay it all at once. We agreed on $200 per month for 4 months, and she promised the first payment would come on the 1st of next month. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes total before we both retreated back to our separate spaces. The landlord called me a few days later and asked if I had time to meet him at his office across town. I drove over during my lunch break and found him sitting behind a desk covered in lease agreements and maintenance requests. He got straight to the point and told me he wouldn't be renewing Iris's portion of the lease when it expired in 3 months. The overcrowding violation and utility issues had created too many problems, and he wanted to avoid future complications with her as a tenant. He offered me first choice to stay in the apartment with a new roommate of my choosing, or I could move to a different unit in the complex if I wanted a completely fresh start. I sat there thinking about what I really wanted, imagining staying in an apartment that held so many bad memories versus starting over somewhere new. The walls themselves felt tainted by months of conflict and stress, and I realized I didn't want to keep living in a space that would constantly remind me of this whole mess. I told him I wanted to move to a different unit if one was available, preferably a 1-bedroom so I could live alone and never deal with roommate drama again. He pulled up his vacancy list and showed me 2 1-bedroom apartments that would be available around the same time my current lease ended. The rent would be higher than splitting a 2-bedroom, but the peace of living alone felt worth every extra dollar. Iris started disappearing for days at a time after that conversation with the landlord. She'd mentioned having a boyfriend a few times before her family moved in, but I'd never met him or heard much about their relationship. Now she was clearly spending most nights at his place, coming back to our apartment only to grab clean clothes or check her mail. Her bedroom door stayed closed even when she was home, and sometimes I'd go 2 or 3 days without seeing her at all. The rent still showed up in our landlord's account on time each month, so technically she was keeping up her end of the lease agreement, but she'd essentially moved out while still paying to keep her room. Part of me felt relieved to have the apartment mostly to myself again, but another part felt sad about how our living situation had disintegrated into this weird limbo. We'd never be friends after what happened, but we also couldn't quite separate completely until the lease ended. I started reaching out to friends I'd been avoiding during the worst of the conflict. People who'd texted asking to hang out while I was too stressed and exhausted to be social. My best friend from college came over one Saturday afternoon, and I told her everything that had happened over the past few months while we sat on my couch drinking coffee. Her jaw literally dropped when I described how Iris's family had taken over the apartment and refused to leave, and she kept interrupting with questions about how I'd managed to stay sane. When I explained my revenge tactics with the internet and utilities and finally inviting my own family to invade, she started laughing so hard she nearly spit out her coffee. She said she couldn't believe I'd actually gone through with something so petty, but also kind of brilliant, and she was proud of me for standing up for myself instead of just accepting the situation. Talking about it with someone who wasn't involved helped me see how truly abnormal the whole thing had been. I'd gotten so used to the daily stress that I'd almost normalized having 6 people living in my 2-bedroom apartment, but hearing her shocked reactions reminded me that none of it should have happened in the first place. My mom started calling every Sunday evening to check on me and make sure things were settling down. I appreciated her support, even though having my whole family invade for a week had been chaotic and stressful in its own way. She kept saying that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, and desperate times call for desperate measures, and a bunch of other phrases that basically meant she thought my revenge plan had been justified. I couldn't really argue with the results since her family had left within 2 weeks of my family arriving, so clearly the mirror tactic had worked even if it made everything more complicated in the short term. She offered to help me move when my lease ended, and I was accepted gratefully since I'd need help carrying furniture and boxes to whatever new place I ended up renting. I started browsing apartment listings online during my lunch breaks at work, getting excited about the possibility of living completely alone without worrying about roommate conflicts or boundaries. The 1-bedroom apartments in my price range were smaller than what I was used to, but the trade-off of having my own space felt worth the sacrifice. I looked at places with good reviews and responsive landlords, determined to find somewhere stable and peaceful after months of chaos. Some listings offered virtual tours, and I spent hours clicking through photos of empty apartments and imagining how I'd arrange my furniture. I bookmarked several promising options and started reaching out to schedule in-person viewings for the following weekends. The idea of starting fresh somewhere new with clear boundaries and no complicated history made me feel lighter than I had in months. The first of the month arrived, and I checked my bank account expecting nothing. But Iris had actually transferred $200 with a note that said, "First payment." I stared at the transaction for a solid minute, genuinely surprised she'd followed through instead of making excuses or disappearing. It didn't fix the broken trust between us or make up for everything that had happened, but it showed she was taking at least some responsibility for her actions and the financial burden her family had created. I sent her a brief text acknowledging I'd received the payment, keeping my message neutral and businesslike. We weren't friends and probably never would be again, but at least she was keeping her word about paying me back. I ran into Grace at the grocery store 2 weeks later while I was picking up milk and bread after work. We both froze when we saw each other in the dairy aisle, and for a second I considered just walking away to avoid the awkwardness. But she approached me first and thanked me quietly for giving them time to find a place instead of having the landlord force them out immediately. She mentioned they'd found a room to rent about an hour away, and both her sons had moved in with friends, so everyone was managing even though money was tight. I didn't know what to say because part of me still felt angry about everything they'd put me through, but another part recognized they were a family dealing with real hardship even if they'd handled it terribly. I told her I was glad they'd found something stable, and we had a few more minutes of uncomfortable small talk before both making excuses to leave. Walking back to my car with my groceries, I felt a complicated mix of relief that they were okay and lingering resentment about the months of stress they'd caused. The apartment felt peaceful now in a way it hadn't since January, with just me and my occasional glimpses of Iris when she stopped by for clothes. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV, cook without anyone criticizing my methods or stealing my ingredients, and sleep without worrying about late-night parties or people arguing in the next room. But the peace also felt empty and sad, like walking through a house after everyone's moved out, and only the echoes remain. The living room where we'd fought so many battles now just held my couch and television, all the conflict and chaos reduced to quiet furniture and bare walls. I realized the whole experience had taken a real emotional toll that wouldn't disappear just because the immediate problem was solved. Some nights I'd lie in bed thinking about how quickly everything had fallen apart, how a roommate relationship that seemed fine had hidden so much potential for disaster. The trust issues and boundary violations had left marks that would take time to fade, and I knew I'd be more cautious about who I lived with in the future. I scheduled an appointment with a therapist the following week, because I needed someone to help me understand how things got so bad. Sitting in her office felt strange, like admitting I couldn't handle my own problems, but I knew I needed help processing everything. The therapist asked me to walk through the whole situation from the beginning, and as I talked, she started pointing out patterns I hadn't noticed. She explained that I had trouble setting clear boundaries and saying no to people, which was why I let Iris's family stay even after the first week turned into obvious lies. I kept thinking I needed to be understanding and compassionate instead of protecting my own space and comfort. She said people with weak boundaries often let situations escalate way too far before they finally push back, and that's exactly what happened with me. The realization made me uncomfortable because I'd always thought of myself as someone who stood up for themselves, but the evidence showed otherwise. I'd let Iris's family walk all over me for months before fighting back, and even then I'd done it through petty revenge instead of direct confrontation. The therapist said learning to set boundaries early would prevent future situations from spiraling out of control like this one had. I left her office feeling both better and worse, relieved to understand myself but frustrated that I'd needed 3 months of hell to figure it out. Back at the apartment, Iris and I had to start coordinating our move out since we were both leaving when the lease ended in 2 months. We communicated almost entirely through text messages, keeping everything practical and avoiding any deeper conversations about what had happened between us. She texted asking when I planned to schedule movers, and I responded with a date. I asked if she wanted to split the cost of a cleaning service for the final walkthrough, and she agreed without discussion. Every interaction felt stiff and businesslike, like we were strangers handling a transaction instead of people who'd lived together for over a year. Part of me wanted to have a real conversation about everything, but another part knew we were both too raw, and the friendship was too damaged. The texts kept coming with logistical questions about forwarding mail, splitting remaining household supplies, and coordinating with the landlord. Neither of us suggested getting together to talk in person, or tried to bridge the emotional distance between us. It felt sad and final, like watching something die slowly instead of all at once. I spent my lunch breaks apartment hunting online, and finally found a nice one-bedroom place about 20 minutes from my current location. The rent was higher than what I paid splitting the 2-bedroom with Iris, almost $200 more per month, but the peace of living alone felt worth every extra penny. I scheduled a viewing after work and fell in love with the space immediately. It had big windows that let in lots of natural light, a small kitchen that was just mine, and a bathroom I wouldn't have to share with anyone. The bedroom was cozy, and the living room had enough space for my couch and television without feeling cramped. I filled out the application that same evening and provided references, pay stubs, and everything else they needed. 3 days later, the landlord called to say I was approved and could sign the lease whenever I was ready. I went to his office the next morning before work and signed all the papers, feeling excited and relieved with every page I initialed. Walking out with my copy of the lease felt like holding a ticket to freedom, proof that I'd have my own space where nobody could invade or take advantage. The security deposit and first month's rent took a big chunk of my savings, but I didn't care because it meant escape from the apartment that held so many bad memories. One evening when Iris actually came home instead of staying at her boyfriend's place, we ended up ordering pizza together almost by accident. Neither of us had eaten dinner and we were both too tired to cook, so I suggested splitting a pizza and she agreed. We sat on the couch watching some random comedy show on television, not talking much but not fighting either. For a little while it felt almost normal, like we were just regular roommates having a quiet night at home. I remembered that Iris wasn't actually a terrible person underneath everything that happened. She'd been funny and considerate before her family showed up, someone I'd enjoyed living with and considered a friend. The situation had brought out the worst in both of us, turning her desperate and manipulative while making me petty and vengeful. Watching her laugh at something on the screen, I felt sad about how completely our relationship had broken down. She'd made really bad choices when her family lost their house, choosing lies and manipulation instead of honesty, and asking for help properly. But I understood that desperation made people do things they normally wouldn't, and homelessness was genuinely scary. When the pizza was gone and the show ended, we both retreated to our separate rooms without discussing the brief moment of normalcy we'd shared. A few days later, Iris knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk for a minute. I let her in, and she sat on the edge of my bed, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in weeks. She told me her parents had found more stable housing, a small apartment in a cheaper area about an hour away that they could actually afford. Her brothers were both doing okay too, with Sebastian working full-time and sharing a place with roommates while Bruno had moved in with his girlfriend's family temporarily. She seemed genuinely relieved that everyone in her family had landed somewhere safe and stable, even if none of the situations were ideal. I told her I was glad they'd found places, and that I meant it despite everything we'd been through. Homelessness was genuinely difficult and scary, and I wouldn't wish that struggle on anyone even after the nightmare they'd put me through. Iris thanked me quietly for giving them the time to find places, instead of having the landlord force them out with zero notice. We sat there for a few more minutes in uncomfortable silence before she went back to her room. The conversation didn't fix anything between us, but it felt like a small step toward acknowledging that real people with real problems had been involved in this mess, not just villains and victims. I started packing up my belongings 2 weeks before move-out day, wanting to be organized and ready. Going through my room, I realized how much stuff I'd hidden away during the months of conflict to protect it from Iris's family. My good dishes were stacked in my closet, my expensive shampoo tucked behind books on my shelf, my favorite snacks buried in drawers under clothes. I'd basically turned my bedroom into a storage unit for everything I valued, living like someone under siege in my own home. Pulling it all out now and packing it into boxes felt both satisfying and depressing. The apartment looked increasingly bare as I packed, with empty spaces on shelves and blank spots on walls where my pictures had hung. Iris was packing too, and we moved around each other carefully, both dismantling the home we'd shared without discussing how strange it felt. I labeled each box clearly and stacked them against my bedroom wall, watching my life get reduced to cardboard containers ready for transport. Each packed box represented another piece of this chapter closing, another step toward the fresh start I desperately needed. My last utility bill arrived in the mail, and I opened it with curiosity to see the final damage. The amount was finally back to normal levels, showing what 2 people actually cost instead of the inflated numbers from when 6 people lived here. Looking at the comparison made me angry all over again because the difference was huge, easily an extra $100 per month that I'd been absorbing. Iris had been paying her half of the inflated bills without complaint lately, continuing to make good on the debt she owed me. I calculated that between the extra utilities, stolen food, and other costs, she still owed me about $400 total. She'd paid $200 so far in monthly installments, and I trusted she'd pay the rest based on how consistent she'd been. I took a photo of the final bill showing the normal amount and texted it to Iris with a note that this was what we should have been paying all along. She responded with a simple acknowledgement and didn't argue or make excuses. The financial aspect was getting resolved at least, even if the emotional damage would take much longer to heal. The landlord scheduled the final walkthrough for the day before we both moved out, wanting to assess the apartment's condition and determine security deposit returns. He arrived with a clipboard and camera, walking through each room and taking notes. I followed him nervously, worried he'd find damage that would cost us money we needed for our new places. He pointed out a few scuff marks on walls and some minor wear on the carpet, but nothing major considering the chaos the apartment had housed for months. In the kitchen, he noted that everything was clean and functional. The bathroom showed normal wear and tear. Both bedrooms were empty and ready for the next tenants. He finished his inspection and told us he'd return most of the security deposit, keeping only a small amount for minor repairs and cleaning. I felt relieved because I needed that money back for my new apartment, and Iris looked equally grateful. The landlord mentioned he was glad we were both moving out because the overcrowding situation had violated lease terms and caused neighbor complaints. He didn't say it meanly, just matter of fact, acknowledging that the living situation had been problematic for everyone involved. We both signed the final paperwork, and he handed us each a check for our portion of the returned deposit. Moving day arrived, and I woke up early to load my car with boxes. Iris was doing the same, and we ended up carrying boxes down the stairs at the same time in awkward silence. We'd help each other occasionally, holding doors open or grabbing the other end of something heavy, but we didn't talk beyond basic coordination. There was so much we could say about everything that happened, all the hurt and anger and regret floating between us, but neither of us knew how to bridge that gap. The words felt too big and complicated to fit into a hallway conversation while carrying boxes. I watched her load her car with the remains of her life here, seeing how tired and sad she looked. She caught me watching and gave a small, sad smile that I returned automatically. We were both exhausted from months of conflict and stress, both ready to move on to whatever came next. My car filled up with boxes and bags, everything I owned packed and ready for transport to my new place. Iris's car looked similarly packed, stuffed full of her belongings and the pieces of furniture that belonged to her. Before I drove away for the last time, Iris walked over to my car and knocked on the window. I rolled it down and she leaned in slightly, looking directly at me for the first time in weeks. She apologized one final time, saying she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again after everything she'd put me through. Her voice cracked slightly and I could see genuine regret in her eyes. I took a deep breath and told her I forgave her but needed distance, that maybe someday we could reconnect but not now, not while everything still felt so raw and painful. She nodded and thanked me, then stepped back from the car. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, watching her get smaller in my rearview mirror as I drove toward my new apartment and whatever came next. I drove to my new apartment building with boxes filling every inch of my car and parked in front of the entrance. The building was smaller than my old place, just a quiet 4-story structure with maybe 20 units total. I carried the first box up to the second floor and unlocked the door to my one-bedroom apartment. The space was empty and clean with hardwood floors and big windows that let in afternoon sunlight. I stood in the middle of the living room and just listened to the silence. No television blaring at full volume, no arguing voices, no footsteps from people who shouldn't be there. The quiet felt so good it almost made me want to cry. I spent the next 3 hours hauling boxes and furniture up the stairs until my arms ached and sweat soaked through my shirt. By evening, I had most of my stuff inside and started unpacking the essentials. I set up my bed first and then moved to the kitchen, putting dishes in cabinets that were actually mine. Every item I placed felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. I made dinner in my own kitchen without anyone rearranging my spices or criticizing my cooking methods. I ate on my couch watching whatever I wanted on television without anyone changing the channel. When I finally went to bed that first night, I lay there in the darkness feeling completely relaxed for the first time in months. No one was going to burst in. No one was partying in the next room. No one was eating my food or using my stuff. This space belonged to me and only me. 2 weeks after moving in, my mom came to visit and see the new place. She walked through the apartment commenting on how nice it was and how happy I looked. We sat on my couch drinking coffee and she told me she was proud of how I handled everything with Iris. I said it felt messy and wrong at times, especially inviting my whole family to make things worse. My mom shook her head and said standing up for yourself doesn't always look pretty, but it's necessary. She reminded me that Iris had lied and manipulated me for months, and sometimes you have to fight back hard when someone won't respect basic boundaries. I knew she was right, but part of me still felt guilty about how everything went down. My mom stayed for lunch and we talked about other things, catching up on family news and making plans for the holidays. Before she left, she hugged me tight and said she was glad I got out of that situation before it damaged me even more. After she drove away, I sat on my couch feeling grateful for her support and validation. A month into living alone, I checked my bank account and saw a payment from Iris for $200. This was her second payment toward the $800 she owed me for utilities and food. I stared at the transaction feeling surprised that she was actually following through. The first payment had come right on time too, exactly when she promised. It didn't erase what happened or fix the broken trust between us, but it showed she was taking responsibility. I thought about texting her a thank you but decided against it. We needed distance and keeping communication minimal felt healthier for both of us. The money helped cover some of my moving expenses and the higher rent I was paying for a one-bedroom. I transferred it to my savings account and went back to unpacking boxes. Over the next few weeks, I focused on decorating my apartment exactly how I wanted it. I bought new curtains in a color I loved without worrying if a roommate would hate them. I hung pictures on the walls wherever I wanted without asking permission. I arranged furniture in ways that made sense to me instead of compromising with someone else's preferences. Every choice felt like reclaiming control over my space and my life. I bought a new rug for the living room, plants for the windowsills, and colorful throw pillows for the couch. The apartment started feeling like home in a way my old place never did, even before Iris's family invaded. I could walk around in my pajamas all day if I wanted, cook at midnight without bothering anyone, play music as loud or quiet as I preferred. The freedom felt amazing after months of having no control over my own environment. One evening, a friend came over for dinner and we sat at my small kitchen table eating pasta. She looked around the apartment and said it was cute and cozy. Then she asked if I'd ever consider having a roommate again to save money. I stopped eating and thought about it. The financial benefits were real since I was paying almost twice what I paid before. But the experience with Iris had left me wary of trusting someone with shared space. I told my friend I honestly didn't know. Maybe someday with the right person and very clear boundaries from the start, but not anytime soon. The idea of someone else having a key to my home and access to my stuff made my stomach tight with anxiety. My friend nodded and said she understood completely after hearing what I went through. We changed the subject and talked about other things, but the question stayed with me for days. Could I ever trust a roommate again? Or was I permanently scarred from this experience? A few weeks later, I was scrolling through social media and saw posts from Iris. The pictures showed her smiling in what looked like a nice apartment with a guy I assumed was her boyfriend. The captions talked about moving in together and starting fresh. I stared at the photos feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was glad she found a stable situation and seemed happy. Her life had been chaotic with her family's housing crisis, and she deserved some peace. But another part of me felt sad that our friendship didn't survive the conflict. We'd been decent roommates before everything fell apart, and I missed having that easy relationship with someone I lived with. I didn't comment on her posts or reach out. We needed to stay in our separate lives for now. Maybe someday we could reconnect as casual acquaintances, but the trust was too broken to rebuild anything meaningful. I closed the app and went back to watching television, pushing thoughts of Iris out of my mind. 3 months after moving out, I stopped at a coffee shop near my old apartment to grab a drink before work. I was waiting for my order when someone said my name. I turned around and saw Sebastian standing there with his own coffee cup. We stared at each other for a second in awkward surprise. Then he asked if we could talk for a minute. I nodded and we sat down at a small table by the window. Sebastian looked different from I remembered, cleaner and more put together somehow. He apologized for his behavior during those months his family stayed at my apartment. He said the whole experience taught his family about respecting boundaries and not taking advantage of people's kindness. His parents were doing better now in their rental situation, and his brother found a job. Sebastian himself was working full-time and saving money for his own place. I listened to him talk and realized I wasn't angry anymore. The distance and time had faded most of my resentment. I told him I appreciated the apology and was glad things were improving for his family. We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics before saying goodbye. As I drove to work, I felt surprised by how pleasant the conversation had been. Around that same time, I noticed I'd stopped having the anxiety dreams that plagued me for months. I used to wake up in a panic thinking I heard people in my apartment, or that Iris's family had somehow found me and moved in again. But those dreams gradually faded as I settled into my new life. The psychological impact of having my space invaded was finally healing with time and distance. I could come home from work without that knot of dread in my stomach wondering what I'd find. I could relax in my apartment without constantly listening for sounds of unwanted guests. The peace felt almost strange after months of being on edge all the time. My neighbor across the hall was a woman around my age who worked as a teacher. We'd exchanged hellos in the hallway and she seemed friendly. One evening, she knocked on my door holding a bottle of wine and asked if I wanted company. I invited her in and we sat on my couch talking about our jobs and lives. Eventually, I told her the whole story about Iris and her family taking over my apartment. My neighbor's eyes got wider and wider as I described the 3 months of chaos and how I finally got them out. When I finished, she said she was amazed I survived that long and would have lost her mind much sooner. She couldn't believe Iris lied about the fumigation, and then claimed tenant rights to stay longer. We talked for hours that night, and by the time she left, I felt like I'd made a real friend. Having someone new to talk to who understood how crazy the situation was helped me process everything better. 6 months after we moved out, I got a message from Iris on social media. She said her family was doing well and everyone had found stable housing. Her parents were working again, and her brothers were getting their lives together. Then she wrote that she'd learned a lot about communication and honesty from what happened between us. She said she understood now that lying about her family's situation was wrong and had damaged our friendship beyond repair. The message was thoughtful and genuine, not defensive or making excuses. I read it twice before responding. I wrote back that I was glad her family was doing better, and I appreciated her taking responsibility. But I kept my response brief and polite, maintaining the healthy boundaries we'd established. We exchanged a few more messages over the following weeks, casual updates about our lives that stayed surface level. The friendship we'd had before was gone, but at least we could be civil to each other from a distance. I decided to host a small dinner party about 4 months after moving into my 1-bedroom apartment. I invited 3 close friends who'd supported me through the whole mess with Iris and her family. I spent the afternoon cleaning and cooking, setting up my little dining table with actual nice plates and candles. When my friends arrived, they immediately commented on how different the space felt compared to my old apartment. One friend said the whole place felt calm and welcoming, like I'd finally created a real home for myself. We ate dinner and talked about work and relationships and normal life stuff, nothing dramatic or stressful. My friend Sarah mentioned how relaxed I seemed compared to during the roommate disaster, when I was constantly tense and exhausted. Another friend agreed and said I looked genuinely happy now instead of like I was barely holding it together. I realized they were right as I looked around my apartment at my friends sitting comfortably in my space. This place was truly mine, with nobody taking over my kitchen or sleeping in my living room or eating my food without asking. I felt proud of what I'd built for myself after everything that happened. The evening ended with everyone helping clean up and promising to do it again soon, and I stood in my kitchen after they left feeling content and peaceful. 2 weeks later, I got a notification on my phone that money had been deposited into my account. I checked and saw it was from Iris, the final payment of $200 that completed the $800 she owed me. I stared at my phone in genuine surprise because part of me hadn't believed she'd actually follow through with the full amount. She'd been making payments consistently for months, but I always wondered if she'd stop before finishing. I opened my messages and typed out a brief thank you, acknowledging that she'd kept her word about paying me back. It felt like the right way to close that chapter of my life, with a simple recognition that she'd done what she promised, even though our friendship was over. She responded with a short message saying she was glad to finally finish paying me back and hoped I was doing well. We exchanged a few polite sentences, and then the conversation ended naturally. I looked at my bank account showing the full amount returned and felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The money didn't fix the broken trust or erase the 3 months of chaos, but it showed Iris had taken some responsibility for her actions. I closed the app and went back to my normal evening, feeling like that part of my past was truly finished now. I found myself thinking about the whole experience more deeply as time passed. I realized I'd learned important lessons about standing up for myself that I needed to learn. Before Iris and her family took over my apartment, I would have kept being nice and accommodating forever, letting people walk all over me because I felt guilty saying no. The conflict taught me that setting clear boundaries from the start isn't mean or selfish. It's necessary for healthy relationships. I should have told Iris no when she first asked about her family staying, or at least been honest about my concerns instead of just agreeing to be nice. I also learned that guilt and sympathy can't override my own needs and well-being. Iris's family was genuinely struggling with homelessness, and that was real and difficult, but it didn't mean I had to sacrifice my own home and peace to fix their problems. The conflict was exhausting and damaged relationships permanently, but I came out of it stronger and more confident in standing up for myself. I knew now that I could handle difficult situations and wouldn't let people manipulate me with lies and guilt trips. The experience changed how I approached relationships and boundaries in every part of my life. I was more direct about my limits with friends, family, and coworkers, and I didn't apologize for protecting my own needs anymore. A year after everything ended, I was genuinely thriving in my 1-bedroom apartment. I'd gotten a promotion at work that came with a significant raise, letting me afford my place comfortably without needing a roommate. My friend network had grown stronger through regular dinners and game nights at my apartment. I had a dating life that was going well, and I felt confident and secure in ways I hadn't before the whole situation with Iris. I occasionally wondered how Iris and her family were doing, checking her social media sometimes to see she seemed happy with her boyfriend. I hoped her parents and brothers had found stable housing and were managing okay despite their earlier struggles. But mostly I didn't think about them much anymore, because that chapter of my life was closed and I'd moved forward. I was at peace with how everything ended, even though it was messy and painful at the time. The situation taught me that sometimes winning means accepting messy outcomes and permanent changes to relationships. Protecting your own well-being isn't selfish even when others are struggling, and you can't sacrifice yourself to save everyone else. I learned that standing up for yourself might make you the bad guy in someone else's story, but that doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. I was genuinely happy now, living on my own terms without anyone taking advantage of my kindness or treating my home like their personal hotel. My apartment was my sanctuary, my space, my rules, and nobody could change that or invade it again. I'd built a life I was proud of and learned lessons that made me stronger, and that felt like the real victory from the whole terrible experience.